Good day, ECO736 students. I trust you had a restful recess and that you came back refreshed for your last term in semester 2. Welcome to the lecture for Development Economics. We'll be focusing on public spending and the poor. Just a friendly reminder, we are in week 7 now. So what you need to submit for this week is your weekly reading assignment number 6. Those who are presenting, please upload your presentation on Canva before the lecture starts on Thursday. Review your lecture slides and clips, and I will see you in the discussion forum on Canva on Thursday during our lecture time. In terms of session outcomes, after the end of this week, you should be able to critically discuss the targeting and incidence of social spending in the South African context. You should also be able to critically discuss the poor conversion of fiscal resource inputs into social outcomes because of inefficiencies in the social delivery system in the South African context. So just to refresh your memory of your undergraduate work, what is the rationale for public spending? Well, there is an efficiency argument, which includes public goods, externalities, and market failures. There is also a merit good argument, where, according to the MIT definition, a good, the consumption of which is deemed to be intrinsically desirable. In the case of such a good, it is argued that consumer sovereignty does not hold, and that if consumers are unwilling to purchase adequate quantities of such goods, like healthcare or education, they should be compelled to do so, normally by the government. The last rationale for public spending is equity, and this focuses on transfers and consumption smoothing, as well as long-run poverty. Please go back to your Bromberger readings, which you covered earlier in the semester, where they focus and describe the primary versus secondary incomes. This becomes important in today's lecture as well, so just go and refresh your memory on that. Please also take some time to refresh your memory in terms of the various ways in which government can influence both primary and secondary income distributions. For today, we focus on mainly government's process that is linked to taxation, as well as the spending of public goods and welfare services, and the transfer of incomes in the form of social grants. So let's consider distribution and the South African budget. We know that income inequality in the market emphasizes the state's redistributive role. The main instrument used by government is the budget, and this is helpful mainly over the medium term. But can fiscal redistribution sufficiently supplement market redistribution without endangering macroeconomic stability? Some issues that we will cover in this lecture, which is linked to the previous question, includes targeting and incidence, as well as answering the question, do inputs, i.e. government spending, translate into the desired outcomes we wish to see? So in terms of understanding how well government targets social spending, we need to consider areas of exclusion as well as inclusion. We wouldn't want government to spend social spending on those who don't need it, okay? And that would occur when we have an era of inclusion. Likewise, we wouldn't want government to exclude anyone from social spending if they are actually suitable for receiving that social spending. So there are some targeting mechanisms that are used. There's what we call means testing, and a lot of our social grants are dependent on means testing, which is mainly dependent on how much you earn as an individual or other criteria. For example, to qualify for a disability grant, you actually need to be disabled. There could also be categorical subsidies or transfers where this type of government spending only applies to specific functional categories like health or education. There is also geographic targeting where government social spending could be targeted either at a rural, for example, a rural area, or for example, an urban area. Sometimes even the hybrids of those geographic areas. And then there is, of course, what we call self-targeting. The expanded public works program is an example of this. And this is a situation where government offers a stipend or a weekly wage that is so low that only the poorest of the poor would consider applying for it. So that's what we call self-targeting. Now, when it comes to government designing different targeting strategies, there are costs involved. For example, there are administrative costs, which are quite high when you are doing, for example, means testing, because it requires collecting a lot of data from potential recipients. There are also incentive costs, and some of the incentive costs could be perverse. It could include moral hazard, and you can read up about this in more of your microeconomic work. There is also stigma if, for example, you think of a feeding scheme at a school. If that feeding scheme is only targeted at the poorest, it may come with stigma, and that is why the Department of Education says we will allow any child at a school to participate in the feeding scheme, so we don't create a stigma between rich and poor. And then there are, of course, always political economy costs, but we don't get into the detail of that in this course. So next up, let's consider the incidence trends in South Africa. Something to bear in mind, and many of you should be familiar with this if you've covered it in public economics or development economics before, but when we speak about incidence or incidence analysis, we are basically trying to understand who is paying for a particular service and who is benefiting from the particular service. Now, in the South African context, there were massive race differentials between different social spending by government, but that started to narrow from the mid-1970s due to international sanctions and pressure from abroad. And because of this, more social spending and redistribution occurred across racial differentials. As a result of this, social spending as a share of non-interest government spending increased sharply over that period of time. It moved from 38.7% in 1982 right up to 48.1% in 2009. However, most social spending now is extremely well targeted. In fact, South Africa's social security system is one of the best in the world, and it is extremely well targeted, partly through household formation. So those social transfers are really going to the poorest of the poor and the most vulnerable. However, tertiary education is not very well targeted in South Africa, and we've chatted about this at different points in the semester. Now, when it comes to targeting, it can occur mainly through three mechanisms. For example, school enrollment is almost universal, and the poor have more children on average, so that means they would tend to benefit more from subsidies for education. This is basic education. The means test targets spending on grants. So all grants that are disbursed are done so through means testing. Another mechanism through which our social spending is so well targeted is the fact that the affluent, those top quintiles in the income distribution, they tend to opt out of a lot of public health services and instead utilize private health services. And in doing that, they don't benefit from the public subsidy or the government subsidy for public health. Now, we'll be talking a lot about fiscal incidence and benefit analysis in this lecture. But one thing you've got to always remember is that it ignores service quality. And so we will find that there's generally a weak link between spending and outcomes in South Africa. So a large share of what our budget is spent on social programs like health, education, social security. And if we look at the amounts that have gone into those different functional areas, if you look at the outcomes, they don't match up. So we spend so much on healthcare, yet our health outcomes remain poor. We spend a lot on basic education, and yet our education outcomes at the lower levels are also particularly weak. This figure here simply drives home the message that the way in which social spending has been split by race over time, specifically here from 1949 to 2006, it has changed quite dramatically. And you can see how those shares in social spending have increased by race. If you look at the black race, for example, when it comes to the white race, their share of social spending from government has decreased significantly, and the Indian spending seems to track the white spending as well, while the spending on the colored race has also slightly decreased, but not as much as white and Indians. Here is another trend analysis starting in 1975 and going to the 2000s, and you can look at the real value of maximal annual social pensions by race, and you can see that at the start of this timeline, the pensions for whites were far higher compared to coloreds, Indians, and blacks, and then over time it moderated. And so here by 1994, the amount that government spends on pensions equalized for all races going forward. The screenomatic is about to end, so I'll start the next one shortly.